I'm a boy, but my mom won't admit it. I'm a boy, I'm a boy, I'm a boy.
Alright, hello there, thrill seekers, and that was a little snip of my cover of I'm a Boy by The Who, and that dress cost me $10 at Goodwill, so that makes it one of my high-budget videos. I hope you enjoyed that. One reason I did that song is because I mentioned Live at Leeds in my previous video, The Who's album Live at Leeds, and on the expanded version of Live at Leeds, it's their own song, so they do that song. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to mention here at the beginning is I'm fine. A lot of people are emailing me and messaging me to see if I'm okay with the recent fires in Los Angeles, and it's understandable because I lived in Los Angeles for like 20 years, and I think a lot of my books say, Brad Warner lives in Los Angeles. I don't live in Los Angeles anymore. I'm 40 odd miles, more than 40 miles away from Los Angeles. There was no fires here. Not that there couldn't be, because this is just as dry and hot as Los Angeles, but we're along. All those things you're seeing on the news are like 50 or more miles away from where I live, so I'm fine. So the title of today's video is Buddhism is a Nerd Subculture, but I want you to notice that the title is not Buddhism is just a nerd subculture, or Buddhism is only a nerd subculture, or Buddhism is nothing but a nerd subculture, because that's not what the title of the video is. So before you write in and complain about that, I think things can be a lot of things. And what I mean by that title is that among the many things that Buddhism is, it is a nerd subculture. So when people use the word Buddhism, sometimes I'm not sure what they're referring to. Nishijima Roshi was good because he had a clear definition of what he was referring to when he said Buddhism. And you had to kind of follow along with that if you wanted to be his student. I have not taken that road myself because I found that people get really mad. In fact, I got kind of mad when I heard him using the Buddhism the way he did, because he was very specific about what he considered Buddhism and what he considered not Buddhism. For example, he did not consider Tibetan Buddhism to be Buddhism. So that's just one example. I don't do that because people get upset and they get mad, and I don't want to have arguments with people. But so there's a lot of things people mean when they say Buddhism, and one of the things they often mean is this kind of nerd subculture. And I'd like to try to explain a little bit of that. And to do that, I'd like to start off by reading you a comment that was left on my Patreon page by a guy who I consider a friend, a guy named Steven, who is writing this comment in, I don't know, goodness. He's doing it to try to help me. So he's not being mean, so I hope this doesn't come off. But it is kind of critical of my previous video, and I want to read it because I think his criticisms are valid, but I also think this gets into the whole nerd subculture thing, so it's one way to kind of dive into that, and because I want to be, transparent about any mistakes that I made. So he lists a bunch of mistakes in my previous video, so let's go. 1. For India, writing originally arose in the Indus Valley civilization in about 2600 BCE, but was lost when the civilization collapsed and wasn't reinvented or rediscovered until 260 BCE. Buddha died in 400 BCE, ergo it's not written down. I was asking why the original Buddhists didn't write down what the Buddha said, because writing hadn't been invented yet. Okay, that's an interesting point. Okay, I know the first reason that I kind of tended to think that writing was around during Buddha's time was because my first exposure to Eastern religions was through the Hare Krishna movement, and they always claimed that their scriptures, the Bhagavad Gita especially, and some other scriptures, were 5,000 years old. Now, I know I should take anything the Hare Krishnas say with a grain of salt, so I haven't necessarily believed that, but it didn't occur to me until I started thinking about this, and I realized that one of the other reasons, a big reason, that I assumed writing was a thing, especially religious writings were a thing in Buddha's time, was because of the Pali Canon, which I talked about, and because of the very piece of the Pali Canon that I read in my last video, which is the Kalama Sutra, or the Kalama Sutra, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. But in there, one of the things, if you go back and watch the video, you'll see the Buddha is made to say, let's put it that way, that you should not go by what's written in scriptures. As among other things, he's saying, don't just go by things, and we'll address this. But so there's a reference there in the Pali Canon to the Buddha talking about written scriptures, written religious scriptures. So, and I've known that passage for a long time, so that's one major reason that I assumed that there were written scriptures at the time. So either that was wrong somehow, or maybe that was interpolated into the text later. I don't know. Maybe some of you scholars out there can tell me why it references written scriptures if written scriptures were not in existence then. Okay. 2. Scholars distinguish between the early Buddhist texts, EBT, the Pali Canon, and Theravada commentaries. EBT includes most but not all of the sutras, some of the Vinaya, and none of the Abhidharma. Okay, if you don't know what those are, you probably have to go look that up yourself because it'll make the video way too long. The EBT are well attested. There's a very long paper that details the accuracy of the EBTs as early text, not transcriptions though. Nobody's saying they're transcriptions. I guess he means of what the Buddha said. It's almost certain that the EBTs, early Buddhist texts, were written by at least the students of the Buddha. Shortly after the Buddha's death, the political landscape of that part of India changed drastically. The EBTs correctly described the historical situation of the Buddha's time, and historical accuracy was not a cultural norm for the time. And he says that, etc., etc. Yeah, okay. But I do know people who are scholars of Christianity who argue that the way the New Testament describes the situation in Rome accurately at the time of Christ doesn't necessarily mean it was written at the time of Christ. So, yeah, okay. But fine. The criticisms, this is number 3, the criticisms of oral transmission or modern conceit. Cultures that rely on oral transmission have been shown to be accurate over hundreds of years, and he goes on for a lot about that. So I say this, I mentioned in the previous video how Buddhism had been an oral transmission for its first 400 or 500 years before it was written down. I've forgotten the number of years, but it's for centuries. And I'm not really critical of that. I don't know if I came across that way. I think you can preserve something accurately in an oral tradition. So, okay, I know a lot of people don't, but that isn't what I meant. So, sorry. Maybe if that came across. Okay, number 4, although it has its roots in earlier sects, Theravada Buddhism doesn't really reach its own until around the 5th century AD, or CE, as some people like to say, with Buddhaghosa and the Path of Purification. That's just the Theravada, and this is, somebody got mad at me for using the word Hinayana, and I know that Hinayana has a kind of negative connotation, but Hinayana is what we usually call the early Buddhist sects, and it was a name created by the Mahayana, who Mahayana means great vehicle, and they contrasted themselves between the lousy vehicle, the Hinayana. And I know it's pejorative, but to call all of the early Buddhist sects Theravada is also incorrect, because Theravada, as Stephen says, is later. It doesn't go back as far as some of the people in the Theravada school would like you to believe. Number 5, the Kalama Sutra says you shouldn't believe things just because you are told them, but only if you practice them and see the fruits for yourself and verify the results. I think that's kind of what I've said. I mean, that's what I meant to say. I hope that wasn't unclear. Number 6, the Dalai Lama is not an authority on the Pali Canon. He's probably never read it, etc., etc. Yeah, you'd have to take that up with Wisdom Publications and the author of that book, because I just read it because it's in the foreword, and the piece I read I think is accurate. But yeah, I never thought he was an authority on the early Buddhism. And he says some other things, but that's kind of enough to get the gist of it. And I got another comment on an earlier video. I posted this talk I'd given about Buddha nature. And someone, probably not quite as kind as Stephen, said this. Because I'd forgotten that I said in that video, I didn't watch the entire video before I put it up because I kind of knew what I said anyway. I mean, I just kind of remembered what I'd said, and I just cut it from the beginning and end. I didn't remember that I'd said something about writing a book about Buddha nature in there, and that was something I was thinking about at the time I gave that lecture, but I'm not thinking about that anymore because I saw that wasn't going to work. Anyway, he says, if you were not willing to learn the basics on what Buddhists had to say on Buddha nature, then you would not be qualified to write about it. I'm not implicating that one cannot be a great practitioner without dwelling constantly on these distinctions. Many famous Buddhist yogis didn't. Some even said that it could be detrimental. On the other hand, it would be negligent to write a book on Buddha nature without knowing not only the intellectual, without knowing not only intellectually but also experientially the above differences. Also differences between Chittamatras, Shravakas, Rantong, and Shetong schools. Such an author would lose credibility instantly, as this doesn't require advanced scholarships. These are the basics. Okay, so all of this stuff, and I'm not trying to call out Stephen. So Stephen, if you're watching, I'm not calling you out because I like you and I know what you meant to say. I am sort of calling out the other guy a little bit, but all of this comes from what I think of as the nerd subculture aspect of Buddhism. So, all right, I worked for 15, maybe more than 15 years of my life at Tsuburaya Productions, which still makes a show called Ultraman, biggest superhero monster show on Japanese TV, going on since 1966 and still going strong. And it's the forerunner of Power Rangers. The show that became Power Rangers was basically a ripoff of Ultraman, and it's guys in rubber monster suits fighting guys in rubber superhero suits, and great fun for kids. I loved it when I was a little whippersnapper because it was run on Channel 43 in Cleveland when I was a little kid. And then I loved it again in my adulthood in a different way. And I was part of the Ultraman nerd subculture. Although maybe I was less of a part of it than some people. But so Ultraman in Japan is very much treated the way shows like Star Trek, movies like Star Wars, the Doctor Who series, if you're British, or actually it's kind of gone out beyond Britain these days, it's treated kind of the same way, where you've got fans who are kind of either children or people who just get into it, adults even, who just get into it for, they like it, and they don't think too much about it. And then you've got people who dig really, really, really deep into it, and it gets a little crazy. I brought down an example. This book came out when I was living in Japan, when I was working for the Ultraman people. And those of you who are German might be able to understand the German title that they gave it. Einleitung in die Ultraman Studien. I don't know. But it's a in-depth study of Ultraman that goes so deeply nerdy. This book is actually way beyond my reading comprehension level. I kind of own it because, I can read bits and pieces of it, but it's really difficult. But they get into so much nerd stuff about what the monsters would be like if you actually had them in real life, and what the organization structure of the Science Patrol, Ultraman's super secret agency that helps him out, what their business and other structure would be, military structure. It's so nerdy. Sorry, wrong side. It's crazy. And that's kind of the stuff that Ultraman generated. And when I was working for Tsuburaya Productions, one of the things that I became aware of was the way the people who actually made the show dealt with that aspect of it, because it was kind of interesting to me. At the time that I joined Tsuburaya Productions in the 1990s, a lot of the people who had created the shows back in the 60s still worked at the company. They were older, but they weren't ancient. They were like in their 50s, and they still worked there. And then there was this other cadre of people like me and like my friend Takeshi Yagi and other people like that, who were in our 30s, who were we'd watched their shows when we were children. They made them when they were adults, and we watched them when we were children, and we were kind of geeks. Otaku is the Japanese word. And for those of you who ever use that word, otaku, keep in mind that to a Japanese person, that sounds really insulting, to call somebody an otaku. And people don't like to use that word. Whereas I see American fans of those kind of shows and anime and stuff going, look, I'm an otaku, and they think it's kind of, I don't know. They don't understand how negative that word sounds. But I was an otaku. Yagi-san was probably a bit of an otaku. My friend Shibuya-san, too. There was a bunch of us who were like that. And the older guys who'd actually made the shows they looked a little bit askance at us, and especially, we were working there, so we kind of had a pass. But the other people, the real fanatics who would show up around the company, everybody, including me and Yagi and everybody, we kind of looked at those people like, ugh, But we also understood that they are an important part of what makes it possible to do the show, because they're some of the major consumers of the things that the company I worked for created. So we understood that we couldn't just slam those people, but we also couldn't, fans like that expect companies like Tsuburaya Productions to consider them in every decision that we make, and then they get very critical when we don't. And I see the same thing happening with the people that make Star Trek and stuff. And it kind of reminds me of the kind of attitude that people who worked for Tsuburaya Productions had towards those kind of deeply geeky fans was well represented in that SNL skit a few years ago. Some of you may have seen it, where William Shatner goes on the show, SNL being a comedy show in America, for those of you who don't know Saturday Night Live. And William Shatner, star of Star Trek, went on the show, and he does a little skit where he plays himself being at a Star Trek convention, and he starts to berate the fans like, get a life!
Get a life, will you people? I mean, for crying out loud, it's just a TV show.
The difference, though, between the nerd subculture that surrounds Buddhism, there's a nerd subculture that surrounds any religion, but Buddhism is the one I know best, is that they don't understand themselves as a nerd subculture, because this is important. I have this on display because one of my other nerd subculture things I love is the Three Stooges, and this is a good example. There's a lot of this stuff. If you don't know, you'd be shocked, but there's a ton of this kind of stuff on the Three Stooges. The Journal of Stoogological Studies. It is done kind of tongue-in-cheek, but the articles in this little pamphlet are very in-depth scholarly studies of different aspects of the Three Stooges. Where they really, the one I've been reading lately, which I haven't finished yet, and I may do a video about this, is called The Three Stooges Announced the Death of God, a Theological Reading. So this guy did a theological reading of the Three Stooges and all the theological references that occur in their movies. And so if you're doing that for the Three Stooges, or you're doing that for Ultraman, upside down, you understand that it is kind of silly, and you do it for a kind of a lark or a even an intellectual exercise, but you don't take it too seriously. The problem with the nerd subculture around around Buddhism is that people really take it seriously. Like, my God, it's painful how seriously people take that stuff. And I'm always kind of interested in things that have a kind of a nerd subculture around them. There's a bunch of things that I like. Almost one of the main reasons I get into them is because there's so much stuff you can look at about them. Like the Beatles, for example. There's so much stuff written about the Beatles, and surprisingly, Black Sabbath. There's a surprising amount of stuff written about Black Sabbath from a very, very intellectual, the heavy metal band Black Sabbath. This is a good example. Experiencing Black Sabbath. Listeners, this is deeply nerdy stuff about Black Sabbath and stuff I'm sure the members of Black Sabbath never even thought of. About their music and their artwork on their album covers and all kinds of crazy stuff. So I find that stuff kind of fascinating. But the thing I've noticed is that stuff, when you're in the outer fringes of that stuff, it's fascinating and entertaining and wonderful in its own way, and I love it. But whenever I've tried to go deeper into it, and I had to kind of go deeper into it as part of my job at Tsuborai Productions, once you go down that rabbit hole, it gets kind of ugly. Like you get people really who are way, way, way too serious about this stuff, and they start arguing. And I've seen people blow up lifelong friendships over the most dumb, trivial stuff about Ultraman or Godzilla, and I'm going, oh God, you guys are taking this way too seriously. Just lighten up on this stuff a little bit. And I see the same thing with Buddhism. My own approach to Buddhism is I'm not a Buddhist scholar. I hope I make this clear. I try to throw this in, every month or so into a video somewhere where I say this and hope that it carries over and people remember this. Because a lot of people assume that I'm trying to be a Buddhist scholar and that I'm just doing a bad job of it. And I'm not. I find Buddhist scholarship incomprehensible. That's one of the big problems I have. I do have a bunch of books. They're mostly up there, the really intellectual nerd subculture books on Buddhism, and I use them for reference material when I'm writing a book, and because I want to get all the facts right and I want to represent the scholarly view on certain topics that I might address in one of my books. But whenever I try to read one of those books, if I try to read them cover to cover, my eyes glaze over it. I'm sorry. Maybe I'm just too dumb, because I'll read this and I'm flipping page after page and I have no idea what the author is talking about. Like I can go for like 10 or 15 pages of being like, I don't know what this guy is talking about. I wish I could come up with great concrete examples, but I can't off the top of my head because I just read it and I'm just going, ugh, I don't get it. To me, Buddhism is, I sort of try to approach Buddhism the way like Takano Koichi or Mitsuda Kazuho or some of the people who worked at Tsuborai Productions approached Ultraman, because they just did it. They didn't worry about the intellectual ramifications of every aspect of the science patrol, or I think this book gets into how you would dispose of a 150-foot monster, if you actually had one that had been killed by a giant superhero in your city. They didn't worry about that stuff. Actually, there's an episode, I think Yagi-san might have been director of this. Somebody I knew was director of this episode of Ultraman, where they did actually, this in one of the 90s ones, where they actually addressed that kind of stuff, because fans had been clamoring about it for years. But they didn't, in general, other than kind of putting a tongue-in-cheek reference to it here and there in later episodes, they didn't bother with that stuff very much. It was just, they were just putting on a piece of entertainment. And I kind of look at Buddhism as something I do. Buddhism for me is Zazen. And Zazen is something I do every morning and every evening, and I've done it every morning and every evening since 1982 or some crazy time ago. And that's what informs that's Buddhist study to me. Buddhist study to me is sitting there staring at a blank wall with my hands, well, you can't see, but my hands all screwed up and everything, and just doing this every day. That's Buddhist study, not reading it in books. And the book stuff is interesting. Dogen certainly was a part of the Buddhist nerd subculture. He was intellectual and he knew all the ins and outs and all this. But I remember Nishijima Roshi, somebody had asked, we were studying there's a chapter that appears in Shobogenzo that's all about the Lotus Sutra. And in my book, Don't Be a Jerk, I called it Twirly Flowers. I think it's called usually people call it the flower of the Dharma turns the flower of the Dharma. And it's a reference to, you don't need to know. But anyway, it's all about the Lotus Sutra. And I remember somebody asking Nishijima Roshi, should we read the Lotus Sutra? And Nishijima Roshi's answer was, you don't need to read the Lotus Sutra. Just read Dogen's commentary on the Lotus Sutra, and it says everything you need to know about the Lotus Sutra. That was his attitude. He did engage in Dogen scholarship to the extent of trying to understand Dogen, but beyond that, it wasn't his interest. It wasn't a deep interest of his to know all the minutia of Buddhist nerd subculture stuff, and it's never been a big interest of mine. And I'm sorry, for people who think it should be. I don't think it needs to be. I don't think you need to. This is kind of part of why I wrote the book Hardcore Zen and why I've been writing all of my books, is because it kind of reminds me of, I had a friend who was a jazz musician, and I said to him something like, I tried to get into jazz, but I couldn't understand it. Because the back covers of jazz albums are always, not always, but often full of these scholarly essays that tell you, what scales and what chords and all this stuff to listen for in it. I couldn't understand any of that. It was all lost on me. And my friend said, just listen to it, and if you like it, then you like it. And if you don't like it, you don't like it. And you don't have to worry about all that intellectual stuff. And the different scales and harmonies and stuff that they use. Do you like the sound of it? That's what matters. And that's kind of what matters to me about Buddhism. It's you don't need to know all that intellectual stuff. You really don't. And when it comes to Buddha nature, what I was saying when I was talking about writing a book about Buddha nature was not what this guy, well, I don't have the comment pulled up anymore, but it's not what that guy talking about the difference between Asvagosa and Zhubadabala and Boobaloo and Doobadabadoo. That doesn't interest me. To me, Buddha nature, in scare quotes, is a name for something that is unnamable, and it's a name that people have used for centuries to try to name the unnamable. Other names in other cultures have cropped up. Christ is often used as a name by Christian mystics for the unnamable, that unnamable something that is the ground of all being and non-being. That's what Buddha nature is, and you can approach that and experience it without knowing what it is, So the intellectual stuff to me is kind of an interesting little side bar to Buddhism sometimes, and occasionally it's useful, but for the most part, I don't. Like I said, when I try to study that minutia, my eyes glaze over. I have no idea. Honest to God, I have no idea what the hell they're talking about half the time. So, yeah, that's my little thing. I could probably go on, but this video is already way too long, so I'm not going to go on. But if you want to donate to me doing what I do, you can do it by going to the URL that you're seeing on the screen below, or that now I'm putting these up. By the way, I'm putting these the soundtracks of these videos up on as a podcast now, so you can find it on Spotify and stuff. And I'll start doing more of that as I go along. So keep your eye on the Hardcore Zen podcast, which is available on Spotify and all the other platforms. But anyway, those of you who are not seeing it, the URL that I'm putting on the screen is hardcorezen.info/donate. That is hardcorezen.info/donate. That's where you can donate to my continued living expenses, and I appreciate your donations, but you don't got to donate if you don't want to. And also those links, if you're watching on YouTube, are in the description of the video, clickable links. All right, we will see you next time. Have a good time all the time. Bye. Hi there, Ziggy. Ziggy is also safe from any of the fires and things. He's also, like me, 40 miles away from the action that you've been seeing on TV. So here he is, just to prove that he's fine. All right, Ziggy, I'm going to go edit the video. Talk to you later.